This series of videos looks at the ending of World War I. By the time we get to this point, Russia has left the war, and the war itself has been dragging on for years beyond initial expectations. But in the final movements of the war, the US joins the war, helping to turn the tide. So this first video examines the impact of American entrance into the war. Before we can understand American involvement in World War I, we need to have an idea of her international policy before this war, which was isolationism. Initially, the U.S. continued to maintain the policy of isolation. That is not to say that she didn't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world, but rather she was happy to have economic relations, but she did not want to get involved in European political affairs. It was a hot mess over there in the 19th century, and she was like, I don't want to get all up in this. So the idea was that she would remain neutral. But in practice, in 1914, the British came to the U.S. and asked them not to sell arms to Germany. And there'd always been a close relationship between Britain and the U.S. once they ironed out all them colonial business stuff. But the U.S. continued to trade with Germany, just not arms. Now, despite this break in 1914, the U.S. did not formally join the war against Germany until April 1917. So, given all of that, she's still making money. She's still friends with everybody. Why did the U.S. decide to join the war? So, let's take a closer look. Over the course of the 19th century, with inventions like telegraphs, which allowed for quick communication, and steam power, which dramatically reduced the travel time between Europe and the U.S., the U.S. developed close relationships with Europe. And this was mainly through increasing international trade. Also, between 1870 and 1900, 12 million people immigrated to the U.S., many of whom kept ties with their families back home, and many of whom still saw themselves as also European and American. The U.S. did not want to see a single dominant power emerge that would potentially throw off the balance of power globally and mess with international trade. And so in 1915-1916, Wilson tried to mediate a peace between the Entente and Central Powers. However, he was most unsuccessful. And which is one of the things that's kind of interesting about this war is that at many points there could have been time for negotiation, but none of the combatants really wanted to negotiate. And there's a but here, a big but. Well, not that big a but a big but. But Germany was kind of her worst enemy here. Germany's policies pushed the U.S. closer to the Entente powers, closer to their side and against Germany. And this came from, as we spoke about before, the treatment of civilians in Belgium and how that angered people and turned public opinion against them. And then the thing that really didn't work out so hot for Germany was the unrestricted submarine warfare, in which American ships were targeted, as well as American citizens losing their lives on ships like the Lusitania. And this basically highlighted the aggression of the Central Powers and pushed the Americans away from neutrality. When we get to 1917, there are a couple of things that are really going to push the Americans towards the declaration of war. The first was Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. Think back and refer back to the War at Sea video and notes, and this changed public opinion. The second thing was the Zimmermann Telegraph. Now, where Germany tried to get Mexico to join the side of the Central Powers in exchange for American territory. This is mostly about the lands that the U.S. had won from Mexico during the wars in the 1800s. And it was sent because the Germans were about to begin unrestricted submarine warfare again, which they knew would anger the Americans and would likely bring them into the war. So, the idea was that with Mexico in the war, Germany would give them some financial help, and it would pull American attention away from involvement in Europe, because the Germans realized that American involvement could change the balance of the war. Now, this telegram was really important, not as a significant threat, but rather the changing of public opinion that allowed Congress to be able to declare war. And also, people are going to be willing to sacrifice their personal liberties and economic comforts in service of the war. Now, the U.S. had a large German and Irish population who were pretty anti-British. Now, the politicians initially, they did not want to upset those segments of the population, but that telegram helped to overcome people's reluctance, and the U.S. declares war on April 6, 1917. If you look at the map on the left, the dark green is Mexico, the light green is the areas promised by Germany to Mexico in the Zimmermann Telegraph, and the red line is the extent of Mexico before the U.S. started chipping away at it. And on the right, you have a translation of the Zimmermann Telegraph. You might want to pause for a little bit and read it. One of the other things that the Zimmermann Telegraph is attempting to do is get Japan to come on Germany's side. And they're asking Mexico to be the mediator. And this is because the U.S. and Japan had tension over influence in the Pacific. And the hope would be that Japan would switch sides from her alliance with Britain, and the carrot to do this would be reducing American influence in the Pacific. Keep in mind, by this time, Japan had already invaded and occupied all of Germany's colonies in the Pacific. Japan chose to stay on the side of Britain and the Allies during the war. And here is a political cartoon published in the US after the release of the Zimmermann Telegraph. And this was one of those things that really swayed public opinion away from Germany and toward accepting and wanting to enter the war. So, US has declared war. Let's look at the impact. If you look at this image here, you can see U.S. infantry troops and African American unit marching northwest of Verdun, France. Now, African Americans made about 13% of the U.S. wartime military, or about 400,000 men. Now, keep in mind, this was a time when there was segregation and severe lack of civil liberties for blacks in the U.S. Initially, the size of the American forces in 1917 was relatively small, and therefore not terribly alarming to the Central Powers. Now, when you think about the size of the armies of the Central Powers and how large they were, the Americans were only able to send 130,000 soldiers, which meant that at the beginning, the Americans were mostly only involved with anti-submarine capabilities of the Entente. The U.S. had a large untapped navy. It had a pretty powerful navy because in 1916, they had passed something called the Naval Expansion Act, which served to dramatically increase the size of the Navy. Now remember that the ability to do something like this in such a short period of time in the US and other countries was really based on the government expansion of their control over the economy and industry during the war. But by 1918, things had changed. In 1917, the US passed the Selective Service Act, which induced conscription. In March 1918, they were able to send 300,000 soldiers to France to help against Ludendorff's offensive. We'll talk about that in the next video. And between May and July 1918, an additional 800,000 soldiers arrived, which allowed the Allies to transfer the experienced soldiers from the quieter parts of the Western Front to fight in the German offensives in June and July. Now, the American forces did not provide the key victory that the commander, General Pershing, had hoped for, but they were a huge, ginormous psychological boost to the Entente because they were bringing in fresh soldiers. Remember that people had been fighting this war and they could not see the light at the end of the tunnel. And by March 1918, the Americans are sending 250,000 soldiers a month to Europe. The other thing is that 1917 was a very, very bad year for the Entente powers. Germany began the unrestricted submarine warfare again, and that meant that a lot of ships were being lost, a lot of food and supplies were not getting to the Entente. By the end of 1917, of course, Russia is done. Okay, let's be real. Even before the end, Russia is done. And Russia leaves the war once we have the Bolshevik Revolution. So that Eastern Front, now Germany is able to bring those soldiers to the West. And you also had the Third Battle of Ypres from July to November 1917, and the British lost 300,000 casualties there. And so the idea here is that victory seemed a long way off, and the US is bringing in a ton of soldiers. By the end of the war, the US had managed to mobilize 4.3 million men. And when you think about it, they started with an army of 130,000. So the Entente, the Allied powers, are having new blood come in while the Germans are steadily losing men. So, one of the biggest things that the US brings in when she joins the war is her economic capabilities. Now, the economic capability basically helped to change the tide of the war. The US was not domestically affected by the war. Therefore, their industrial and agricultural production remained at the maximum, and they're able to provide their allies with food. And in a very real way, the war actually pushed the US to expand to her potential in terms of industrial capability. This massive industrial capability also meant that they could produce large quantities of material needed for the war, like tanks, munitions, jeeps, etc. Looking at the picture, you can see just as in Britain, the US created the Land Army of Women to work in agriculture and take over the role of men off to war fighting. And this happened in a number of industries where women stepped up and did those jobs until the men came home. So next we have a series of graphs that provide some information about the industrialization and economic capabilities of the combatant countries. So do look at the US's economic development, but also consider the other countries and the impact that this has on their ability to fight a long war. Also, think about total war and what these figures might mean. I'll pause in each graph for about 10 seconds, but it would also be a good idea for you to pause the video to analyze the charts. This one looks at the per capita levels of industrialization, or the industrialization per person, and the baseline is Britain in 1900. And this one looks at iron and steel production of the combatant countries from 1890 to 1938. So really pay attention to what was happening before the war in 1913. We've come to the end in sum. So let's stop and answer the question, what was the importance of the American entry into the war? Now, you're going to need to write a short essay, so make sure that you include information looking at the entirety of the war, not just what it was covered in this video. And here is your surprise! Why did the birdie go to the hospital? Aww. To get a tweet!